Hi, everyone. I'd like to open the scriptures with you today on this Monday and look into the book of Esther, one of the sweetest stories in many ways. Very popular story. It's fun to read. It's a joy and a delight to dig into this story. I read through it a few days ago in my own personal devotional time, and I read it out loud in one sitting, and it took about 30 minutes, and it's a great story when you read it that way. It's not just a story, though, is it? It's in the scriptures. It's a story about God's people and God's work in God's people to preserve God's people. And as you probably know, the most famous feature of the book of Esther is that it doesn't actually mention God ever in the text explicitly. No one is described as praying to God, and he is not mentioned by name or title, and yet he is the main character somehow. And it's fun to explore those things. This story is history. It's about real events that took place at a real time. And I'm not going to go through the whole book with you today, but what I'd like to do is simply raise a question and show you what I see as the answer to that question. And the question is, how does Esther point to Jesus? How do we see Jesus foreshadowed, typologically prefigured in Esther, both the woman and the story? And I'll show you how I see that, at least at one level. Most folks, when we look at the book of Esther, typically we look at the topic of God's providence. Again, we see his handiwork, his handprints, his fingerprints all over the story, even though he's never actually mentioned. And so it's fascinating to see how that unfolds. I'll depend on you to be familiar with the details of the story, since we're not going to look at those details closely as I read through this. So if you haven't read Esther recently, pause this and why don't you sit down and take a read. Read it out loud if you can. If you can carve out an additional 30 minutes, go ahead and read it. And then come back to this video later and see what you might see as to where you think Esther points to Jesus most clearly. Our conviction is that Jesus taught us all of the Old Testament scripture points to him. And so the question is, how do we see that in different events and different stories and different characters and different passages? And so I'll show you what I see here. But let me give you a little bit of the background. It's important to remember, and I'll fill in some details that you might overlook when you're reading through this story. The book begins with a date and a historical marker. Now, in the days of Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus is the Hebrew rendering of the Persian king. His name is Ahasuerus. If you're reading the NIV or some other versions, you might read the name Xerxes, 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 and that is the Greek spelling of his name. The Hebrew is Ahasuerus, and it's closest to the Persian that we know of from history of this particular individual. We know when he ruled over the Persian Empire, 485 to 465 BC. So he had about a 20-year reign over the Persian Empire. Now, what's interesting to remember about this time frame is that the Persians are ruling over the people of Judah, the Jewish people. The Persians gave permission to the Jewish people, however, to return to their home in Judah, and specifically to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. That happened many years earlier. Construction on the temple was finished about 515 BC, about 30 years before this, the completion of the temple. And before that, you go to 539 BC, and the Persian Emperor Cyrus is the one who issued the decree that allowed the Jewish people to return. They had been in exile under the Babylonians, and then the Persians came along and conquered the Babylonians. And when Cyrus the Persian came to rule over that territory and over the Jewish people, he allowed them to go home, to return to the land of Judah and to Jerusalem to build their temple to Yahweh their God. And so what's fascinating about this story in Esther is its setting. It's not in Judah. The Jews that are featured in this story are in Persia. They're in the Persian Empire. They're away from the homeland. And so that's a big question mark that comes up over this story and the characters of this story. Oh, why didn't this family that we're going to learn about, Mordecai and Esther, why didn't they return? Why did they remain in Persia rather than go home? And it puts a little bit of a question mark on the faithfulness of these Jewish characters. We tend to see Mordecai and Esther as ideal Jewish people, doing what Jewish people do best. But I'm going to point out some details that actually call that into question. That's not the primary purpose of looking at the book of Esther today, but it is significant to remember that God is not protecting them. God is not blessing them because of their obedience. He's blessing them because of his faithfulness to his covenant and his promises. And in spite of their disobedience, God is still preserving them, even though many of them, most of the Jewish people, remained in exile. They chose not to go home when they could. And there are various reasons for that. The journey was going to be difficult. When they got back to Judah and got back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, they were going to face obstacles and opposition and difficulties. It wasn't going to be easy. It was going to be very difficult and very challenging, and it was for those who returned. And so many people just felt like it was just easier to stay in exile physically. But the book of Ezra and Nehemiah looks at those people who remained in exile and paints them in somewhat of a negative light to indicate that they were being disobedient, they were being unfaithful, they were not trusting Yahweh their God, and so they didn't return home, and that was an act of disobedience. And so Mordecai and Esther seem to be caught up in that. We tend to assume a lot about Mordecai in particular as we read this story. To assume his motives at times. I'll draw your attention to a couple of those places and just try to caution us about thinking too much about their motives. So the Jews have been able to return home for a long time now, since 539 BC. The temple is up and running in Jerusalem for the past 30 years or so, and yet many Jews remain outside of the land of Judah and remain in exile. And the family that we're going to be introduced to here in this story are among those Jews who remained outside the land. But the story opens with a picture of Ahasuerus and his Persian Empire. The story opens, and the real drama of the story opens when he throws a big festival. He began his reign in 485 BC. The dates that are given in the story and some corresponding historical material that we can read in Persian literature would indicate that this event took place somewhere around 482 BC. So maybe after he'd been ruling the Persian Empire for about 3 years. And so his empire is being settled, and he's being established as the ruler of the Persian Empire, and he throws a big festival, a big party. There's a lot of drinking in the book of Esther. It's just all over the place how much drinking and drunkenness is depicted in the book of Esther. But you remember the story. The King Ahasuerus, is bragging and boasting about the beauty of his wife, and his wife was throwing a bit of a drinking party with the women of the court in her own quarters, and he calls for her because he wants to essentially show her off. This is kind of an ugly picture of the kind of king that Ahasuerus was, the kind of character that he had. He didn't think much about the dignity of his wife. And he would use her as a plaything and a trophy to show off to other people. And she refused to come. She said, "No, I'm not coming. I'm not going to submit to that kind of abuse." And when she does that, he's enraged. But not only is he enraged, his officials are enraged, and they're concerned that her example is going to spread throughout the kingdom, that other women will disobey their husbands. And so to prevent that, his officials suggest to him that he depose her, that he get rid of Queen Vashti, his wife, and replace her with someone else. And so he gives in to that. We see King Ahasuerus here not being a very strong leader. He is influenced by everybody around him. And we even see Mordecai and Esther somewhat taking advantage of that reality later, and it works out well for them. But nevertheless, he's a bit of a pushover, and he gives in to the advice of his advisors. Vashti is deposed, and then they start looking for a replacement. And so that means that Persian officials went out throughout their kingdom and started gathering all the beautiful women so that they could come and present themselves to the king and seek to impress him so that they might be a good candidate for his next primary queen. Now, like most emperors or kings in the ancient world, he had a harem, which involved many women. There was usually a primary queen he would be married to, and her children would be the legal and rightful heirs to the kingdom. But he would have other women that he would be free to have intimate relations with. And they would be called concubines, and they would have certain privileges and certain rights, but their children were usually not in line for the inheritance or to sit on the throne, but they were really there for the king's personal physical pleasure. It is very common in the ancient world. And so he is basically having a tryout of sorts to see who can impress him the most. And so that's where we find Esther showing up in this story. She's a Jewish woman who lives in Susa. And Susa is one of the major capital cities of the Persian Empire. It's in Persia proper. And Susa is where Mordecai and Esther live. Now, Mordecai is Esther's uncle. And we're told he's a Benjaminite. So he's a descendant of Kish. And he is from the tribe of Benjamin. Esther's actually his cousin, the daughter of his uncle, we're told in chapter 2, verse 7, and her parents had died. And so he adopts her. We don't know why. We don't know why he is the one who took her in as his own daughter and sought to raise her, but he did. And Esther then, because they lived in Persia, they lived right there in the capital, she was selected as one of the women who would be considered to become the new queen. Now, when she was taken, what we find is that Mordecai tells Esther, don't let them know that you're a Jewish girl. Don't let them know that you're a Jewish girl. We see that in verse 10, Esther 2:10. And we're not sure why. Why does Mordecai do this? Why does he not want her to let them know that she's a Jewish girl? And I have no idea. The text doesn't tell us, and so we'd best not speculate too much. But what are his motives here? It's unclear what he's up to by wanting to keep her ethnicity, but it turns out to be an important detail in the story. So we fast forward and we see this competition going on essentially, and Esther is given favor, and we're supposed to see as the way the story unfolds that God is the one who's granted her this favor. God is the one who causes providentially the guy who's overseeing these women and overseeing this contest, as it were, to rise to the top, that she would become the most favorable of all of them. And so she makes it through several rounds of presenting herself to the king, and the king loves her. The king shows attention to her, shows favor for her. Now what we see here is another date marker, and it's important to note this because some time has passed. So if our historical records are accurate, and we can tell that Vashti, Queen Vashti, was removed in about 482 BC, then what we can see is that we have the 7th year of the reign of Ahasuerus mentioned in verse 16, when Esther is chosen as her replacement. This is going to be in the middle of 479 BC. 479 BC. So a few years have passed. A few years have passed since Vashti was deposed. So Esther is chosen as her replacement, and a feast is thrown. Feast with lots of drinking and eating, but a grand feast. There's lots of feasting, there's lots of drinking in this book. Now it's in chapter 3 that we are introduced to Haman. We usually say Haman, and that's fine. Haman, or Haman. He is introduced to us as an Agagite. An Agagite. Now that's not a detail to be passed over. He's the villain in the story, and he is a descendant of Agag, or Agag, who was a descendant of Amalek, who's of the Amalekites, who is a descendant of Esau. And so we're supposed to recognize when we read this story that Haman is not just a bad man, a villain in this particular moment in history, but he runs in a line of villains, enemies of God's people, opponents of God's people, haters of God's people, going all the way back to Esau, the brother of Jacob. But specifically, one of Esau's sons was Amalek, which created the Amalekites, which gave Israel such trouble while they were wandering through the wilderness. You can read about that in Exodus chapter 17. But then they pop up again in 1 Samuel chapter 15, where we read about King Saul seeking to fight against them. And he was instructed by God to wipe them out completely, and Saul did not do that. He preserved Agag, the king, alive. Now, he didn't preserve him long because Samuel steps in, chastises Saul, and then kills Agag himself, slices him up into pieces with a sword. So Samuel kills him. Now, apparently, Agag had other descendants somewhere because Haman is a descendant of Agag. And so the villain in this story is not just a bad guy in this little isolated sense, but he represents all of the enemies of God's people in the ancient world. He goes back all the way to the prototypical enemy of God's people, and that is Esau, the brother of Jacob. So Haman steps up. He's exalted to a high position in the Persian Empire, and he gets into a little beef of Mordecai, the Jew. Mordecai chooses not to bow down to Haman or respect him in his new role, and Haman freaks out. He goes into a crazy rage. He finds out that Mordecai is a Jew, and he decides, because Mordecai has slighted me, I'm going to make sure all of the Jews suffer for that. So Haman is presented very much as a crazy person, and we are meant to see that way. And so this occurrence when Haman sets the plot and begins to advise King Ahasuerus that there are these wicked people in his kingdom called the Jews that need to be annihilated, and King Ahasuerus says, okay, we'll do that, is in 474 BC. So an important detail that we need not gloss over, that we shouldn't gloss over here, is that Esther has been queen of Persia for about 5 years, from 479 BC to 474 BC. She's been the queen of Persia, and for 5 years, she has managed to keep her Jewish identity a secret. What does that mean? That means that presumably she has not practiced any of the Jewish customs. She has not practiced the Jewish holidays. She's married to a Gentile, which was a no-no, and a pagan. She didn't have a choice in the matter, really, but still, she's married to a Gentile. She doesn't practice any of the Jewish holidays, and she doesn't celebrate any of the Jewish feasts. She doesn't keep the Mosaic Law, it seems. She looks like a Persian, smells like a Persian, acts like a Persian, and for all intents and purposes is a Persian queen. That's an important fact to remember when we think about what's going on here and what she does and how she does it in the coming pieces of the story. So, Haman sets up the king to make this decree. And remember the way that this is worded. This is just gross. Verse 13 of chapter 3, Esther 3:13. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with instructions to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. So Haman has the kind of influence, and King Ahasuerus has the kind of gullibility that genocide just needs to be suggested by Haman, this recent upstart who's been elevated to a position in the kingdom, and he suggests genocide against this people, and King Ahasuerus just says, yeah, that sounds like a good idea, let's do that. And so Haman gets away with this, and then they go back down and they go drinking again. Again, lots of drunkenness, and that might be why the king is so influenced by other people. Chapter 4 is the pivotal chapter, and that's where we'll kind of hone in and look for a way that Esther might point us to Jesus. This is the famous part of the story, the pivotal moment, the turning point when all of this unfolds. So Mordecai finds out about this decree because it's published through the whole land. So all the Jews are freaking out. They hear about this, that they have been opposed this way, and that there's been this attack against them, and that there's a date set on the calendar that they're going to be slaughtered, presumably. So Mordecai found out about it, and then Mordecai grieves this. Esther 4:1. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. And verse 3, in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. Notice what is not mentioned, but is often assumed. There's no mention of prayer in the midst of this. Not from Mordecai and not from the Jews spread out throughout the Persian Empire. Sometimes we assume that there's a mention of fasting. There must have been praying as well. And maybe there was. But it is an interesting omission by the narrator who's telling the story. They're grieving their doom here, and there seems to be no hope, and they're not crying out to the Lord, which frankly fits really well with what we know from other books, Ezra, Nehemiah, about the Jewish people during this season after they've returned to the land. They are not faithful to the Lord. They haven't learned their lesson in exile. They have not returned to faithfulness to God. And so Mordecai and Esther seem to be these Jews who have remained in rebellion against God out in exile in the Persian Empire, and God is going to use them anyway. That's the glory of this story in a lot of ways, is that God uses them even though they're still in exile, and they don't seem to be responding with the kind of faith you would expect. Now, there is a glimmer of hope and maybe a trickle of faith in Mordecai that we'll see in just a moment. But Mordecai has seen this decree. Now, what's interesting is that Esther knows nothing about this. And so this decree has gone out throughout the empire, but Esther doesn't find out about it within the confines of the kingdom. And so we don't know whether she's just aloof and is unaware, or whether the way this decree of genocide was published, it was not done in a way that was official or upfront, or in a way that the queen would even take notice of. And so she doesn't seem to be aware. So Mordecai sends word to her and brings her attention to this matter. And Mordecai tells a messenger to tell her about this. And Esther's response initially is, there's nothing I can do about this. Esther chapter 4, verse 10. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. So Esther says, there's nothing I can do about this. I can't go to him. He'll kill me. And so initially, she's just thinking about herself. She's like, there's nothing I can do about it. Why are you telling me about it? If I go to him to try to talk to him about this, I'm going to be killed. He hasn't called me in 30 days. Now think about that for just a minute. This is the replacement of Queen Vashti. This is his new queen. He has a harem, and so he's apparently been occupying himself with other women in his palace, and he's got no interest in Esther right now. And her concern is that if she approaches him without being asked, without being invited, then he's going to execute her on the spot, because that's the law. It seems like a really weird law, doesn't it? But that's the way it was in the Persian Empire for this particular king. He didn't want to be messed with except for those he wanted to influence him and to bother him. He didn't want to be bothered all the time, I guess, and so he issues these kinds of decrees. Well, Mordecai is not going to accept that. Mordecai thinks that you are our best hope, but he doesn't believe that she's their only hope. He's got enough of good biblical theology still resting in his memory, Because think about this. If they're in Persia, in Susa, the capital, and they've been living their lives there, because the age of Esther, at least, as a young girl who would be invited to fill this role of the queen, the Persian queen, she must be pretty young. And so for her, she's never known life in Judah. That's probably true for Mordecai as well, since the Jews had been in exile for almost 70 years. And it's been 30 years plus since then, since they were allowed to go home, 539 BC. It's been 60 years, actually. So Mordecai has lived in outside the land of Judah for his whole life, and so has Esther. And so they've never known life in the land of Judah. It would be surprising to me if they actually knew much about the Jewish scriptures, if they knew much about Torah, about the instruction, the law of Moses. They don't seem to be keeping that. And so it's highly unlikely, I think, that Mordecai would have taught his daughter the law of God, that he would have taught Esther their history. But he apparently knows enough about it to have this little theological nugget that's drilled into his brain that he can't seem to let go of. This is the famous line in Esther 4, verse 13. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish." Now, we get excited about that line, and there is some theological underpinnings of that line that goes back to the Mosaic covenant and God's commitment to his people Israel, so that God is going to keep his people, right? God is going to restore his people. He's always going to keep a remnant of faithful Jews, faithful people for himself. He's going to keep a remnant of believers for himself, always. He's committed to do that. They will never be snuffed out completely. And so that theological nugget is in the back of his mind. But I think he goes beyond that in his application here to her. He says, if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. If you don't do something about this, somebody will. God will make this happen somehow. Even though he doesn't actually speak of God doing it, he still has in the back of his mind probably what he was taught as a boy, that the Jewish people are God's covenant people, and God will remain faithful to his covenant and preserve his people. He will not allow them to be snuffed out completely. But then he goes further than that, and he says, you and your father's house. Note the self-serving note there. Who is her father's house? Well, it's Mordecai. There may be others, but it's Mordecai. And so he's saying, I'm going to die if you don't do anything about this. And that may have struck an emotional chord with Esther because he raised her. He took care of her when her parents had died. And so he introduces that into this, even though he doesn't have a basis for this reality, that she and her father's house will perish. Think about it. If she has successfully kept her Jewish identity a secret for the past 5 years, at least, I think she'd be able to keep that secret. Don't you? Why would this gullible King Ahasuerus ever suspect anything if she's been keeping this secret all along and she just keeps doing what she's doing? If she looks like a Persian queen and acts like a Persian queen, why would she be anything other than a Persian queen? And certainly Haman has no inkling of this. We see that later very clearly. He's shocked to find out that she's a Jew. And so she's kept her identity, her Jewish identity, completely under wraps. And so for him to say, you and your father's house will perish, I think he might be manipulating her emotions a little bit here and in a self-serving way wanting to preserve himself. But who knows? This is the famous line. Who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? It's a beautiful line. It's very powerful. And I think Mordecai is a powerful communicator here. He might be a good manipulator even. But this is a wonderful line. He speaks better than he knows, perhaps. And the Hebrew is even more wondrous than what we see in English. Who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? In Hebrew, it's a passive verb. Who knows whether you have not been brought by God to the kingdom for such a time as this? Well, Esther's persuaded. And I wonder again, what is her motive? Is she persuaded out of concern for caring for her, the man who raised her, Mordecai, or is she concerned for the continuance of God's people. She tells the servants to go reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do." Now, what's interesting about this, again, there's no mention of prayer here, but she wants them to fast. And there's a lot more that we could say about this fasting that is for another time perhaps, but fasting in the ancient world is a very common practice. It's a cultural kind of practice, and it's actually never mandated in Scripture for God's people, either the nation of Israel or Christians for the church. It's never commanded of all God's people. Fasting is somewhat akin to tearing one's clothes. It is typically associated with grief or mourning, and that includes grief and mourning for death, and also grief and mourning for sin. So it's like tearing one's clothes. When somebody tore their clothes in the ancient world, that was an outward physical expression that other people could see that you are grieving or you are repenting of some sin. And so fasting is very much like that. It's a physical expression where you abstain from food in a way that other people can see. That shows that you're expressing grief or loss. And that's the significance of fasting in the ancient world. But it came to have an almost magical sense, an almost magical property. And I see this a lot in today's world when Christians or false teachers even write about fasting. They often write about how powerful fasting is and how it can unleash God's power in your life. And I find no biblical justification for that kind of idea. But it goes back on this pagan idea that you can manipulate the gods by abstaining from certain foods, or you can manipulate the gods by beating yourself. It is to abstain from certain foods or from certain things can be a way of changing your circumstances almost superstitiously. It doesn't have to be that way. There are good reasons to fast, and obviously we see the apostles fasting on occasion, but that's a topic for another time perhaps. But here note what is not said. It doesn't say she prayed or she instructed them to pray or that they did pray. Instead, don't eat, don't drink. And my young women, my young Persian attendants will do the same thing. So there's no religious aspect in this fasting, at least for Esther and her women. Those are Persian attendants that are with her to do this. And then here it is, the great act. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. It's at this moment, this line, where I think we should see a foreshadowing of Jesus. How does Esther point to Jesus? It's in this moment. She chooses, she volunteers to be identified with her people. She will go to the king, even if it means the loss of her life, if she can potentially rescue her people from the certain destruction. Because what she has to do, and what she will do, as the story unfolds, is she will reveal her identity. She will acknowledge her connection to these people who are under condemnation. She will, in that sense, say, I am under the sentence of condemnation that you, king, have issued. I am to be destroyed. I am to be killed. I am to be annihilated, as the decree with your signet ring on it has ordered. And so in that sense, Esther foreshadows Jesus, who in a much greater way identifies with his people who are under the condemnation of God. Not the condemnation of some king, but the condemnation of God. And not unjustly, the way that this condemnation is, but justly. Jesus suffers the condemnation of God's wrath and God's punishment for our sin. He identifies himself with humanity. He becomes a man. He becomes flesh. And ultimately, he who knew no sin became sin. God made him who knew no sin to be sin, so that we might become his righteousness. And so it is that Jesus identifies himself with sinful people, identifies himself with people under the condemnation of God, And unlike Esther, who is spared the judgment, and so also are the people with whom she identifies, all the Jews will be spared the condemnation. Unlike that, Jesus actually experiences the condemnation. He is slaughtered. He is executed under the sentence of condemnation. And through that, the people with whom he has identified go free and are not destroyed, killed, and annihilated. So it is that aspect of this story that points us most clearly to Jesus. There may be some other hints here. Usually we look at the story as a good story to illustrate God's providence, and it is that. But the real significance of the story in the grand story of Scripture is about this moment, about a person. And so even a woman here, even a woman who is a Gentile, acting like a Gentile at least, she is ethnically Jewish, but she's a Persian queen, who identifies herself with the Jewish people, maybe for the first time in her life, really, only to put herself in that place of condemnation in order to set her people free. You know the rest of the story. It goes really well, right? The king does hold out his scepter to her so that she is welcome to come present her request, and then everything goes bonkers from there, right? Instead of getting right to the point, she invites King Ahasuerus and Haman to come to a feast. And at the feast, she has another opportunity to present her request, and she says, come to another feast tomorrow. So King Ahasuerus and Haman come again to a second feast, and it's then that she reveals her identity as a Jew, and she identifies Haman as the enemy, the opponent, the villain in the story. He's executed, and the people are spared. There's lots of other details that go on there, but it's a wonderful story all told. But it's important to notice the details. It's important to notice what's not said, and to resist the temptation that we often have in reading and inserting things that distract us from the actual meaning and unfolding of the story. So I hope that helps you see one way that the book of Esther, a book that we don't tend to think about in connection with Jesus very much. It's not quoted in the New Testament explicitly, but it is a book that is meant to foreshadow Jesus in this way. And so it is that we can be thankful that Jesus volunteered himself. He wasn't forced or compelled against his will to come into a position. He wasn't manipulated or cajoled like Esther kind of was. Initially, she was resistant to the idea. Jesus was not resistant to the idea of coming to stand in our place, in the place of condemnation, to receive the condemnation that we deserve. He did it willingly and eagerly and gladly, even though his experience of condemnation was much, much more than Esther could have ever experienced. And so we can be grateful for the work that God's done for us, and we can maybe see another dimension of how that looks, of how he identifies himself fully with humanity. That's why it's so important that we recognize Jesus as a human. Jesus is fully human. He took on human experience. He took on human flesh, and ultimately he took the guilt of human sin upon himself on the cross. And by doing that, he set us free from our condemnation, free from our slavery to sin. And Esther paints a contour of that with a different color that might be helpful for us to grasp and to get into our minds a little bit. We pray. Father, thanks for this picture that's given to us in the Old Testament to give us some clarity on how you preserve your people, yes, but even more so how you save your people from ultimate destruction. You've done it through a human being. You've done it through your Son taking our place, identifying yourself with us in our sinfulness, making him sin, making him to be sin, treating him the way that you treat sin, opposing it, expressing your full vented hot wrath against sin on the cross. Thank you that you've done that, so that we do not have to sit as the recipients of your wrath. We will never experience your wrath because Jesus took it all for us. So thank you, Lord, for the great work that you've done. Thank you for this picture that teaches us a little bit more about that. And Thank you for your providence that's depicted so clearly in the book of Esther. You really are at work in the details of our lives. You are at work in the details of unexpected things. And you are at work in the shaping of the big and the small outcomes of our circumstances. And so we can trust you with all that is going on in our world and all that is going on in our individual lives. Would you give us grace to do that in the days to come? In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.